The cold iron case is open in front of you tonight, its folder faintly rough beneath your fingertips, smelling of old paper, dust, and a little rain. Settle in and let the pace become slow. You don't have to solve anything quickly here, because this is the kind of case that waited for years, quietly, while small pieces of evidence kept their own patient company in envelopes, drawers, and cardboard boxes. You can picture the first page as it might have looked after many hands had touched it. The typed lines are a little pale. The corners have softened. A paperclip has left a rusty crescent on the upper edge, the sort of mark nobody studies at first, though later it seems almost like the file was always asking you to look closer. The cold iron case did not begin with a grand answer. It began with ordinary things: a road, a room, a few people trying to remember exact times, a detective writing carefully, because memory can be delicate, and because years later, someone like you might return to the same page. About patient detective work is that it often depends on evidence that seems too small to carry much weight. A faded receipt, a bit of tape, a scratch in paint, a smell someone noticed and almost didn't mention. In the cold iron case, the evidence that mattered most did not announce itself. It waited. It sat in storage while seasons passed outside the courthouse windows, while fluorescent lights hummed over desks, while new cases arrived and old ones slipped farther back on the shelf. And so tonight, we'll move through it slowly, the way a careful investigator does when the office is quiet and the night has made every sound softer. You turn the first page, and the file gives you a date, a place, and a handful of names. It gives you statements taken in tired voices. It gives you photographs with white borders and handwriting on the back. It gives you a map folded along the same crease so many times that the paper has begun to remember the shape. At first, the cold iron case looked like one of those investigations that would be answered by people. Someone would have seen something. Someone would have heard a car door, or noticed a porch light, or remembered a face at the edge of an ordinary afternoon. That's how investigators often begin. They walk outward from the center. They knock on doors. They ask the same question in several gentle ways. They listen for what changes and what stays the same. You can imagine the notebook in your hand as you follow them. The cover is black. The pages are lined. The ink presses a little deeper where the detective leaned harder, perhaps late in the day, perhaps after too much coffee and not enough sleep. There are names in the margin. There are phone numbers with small arrows beside them. There are a few words underlined twice, not because they prove anything yet, but because they feel as if they may matter later. The early witnesses in the cold iron case offered fragments. One person remembered the weather. Another remembered the sound of a vehicle passing slowly. Someone else recalled a piece of clothing, but wasn't sure about the color once they had said it aloud. You learn, as you sit with old statements, that people are rarely careless on purpose. They are simply human. They remember under imperfect light, through windows, through worry, and through the soft blur of ordinary life. That is why evidence can become a kind of second memory. It doesn't grow tired. It doesn't try to please the person asking questions. It doesn't fill silence with guesses. It sits there, plain and quiet, waiting for the right question to be asked. In the cold iron case, the first evidence collected seemed routine. Fibers were placed in envelopes. Dust was lifted from a surface. A small object was photographed, tagged, and logged in a careful hand. Nothing about it felt dramatic. That matters, because most patient investigations are not shaped like stories at first. They are shaped like work. You can hear the soft scrape of a chair in the records room. You can feel the chill of the metal cabinet handle. You can smell copier toner and cardboard, and the faint mineral scent of rain drying on coats hung near a doorway. The detective doesn't know which detail will matter, so the detective preserves what can be preserved, writes what can be written, and leaves a trail for the future. The first odd piece of evidence was easy to overlook. It was small enough to be mistaken for debris, and ordinary enough that no one in those first hours would have wanted to build a theory around it. A bit of material, dark and brittle, caught where it should not have been. The note beside it was short. The photograph was unremarkable. If you were tired, you might turn past it without stopping. But tonight, you don't turn past it. You let your eyes rest there, the way a cold case detective might, years later, after learning that the loudest facts are not always the most loyal ones. You notice the scale ruler in the photograph. You notice the shadow cast by the evidence marker. You notice how carefully someone had circled the item in pencil on a copy of the original image, as if making a quiet promise to return. At the time, the tools were limited. There were labs, of course, and trained people doing patient work with microscopes, chemicals, comparison charts, and the steady habits of forensic procedure. But there were also limits that belonged to the era. Tests took time. Some samples were too small. Some results came back as possibilities rather than answers. A detective could ask the lab for help, but the lab could only answer the questions science was ready to hear. So the cold iron case moved forward in the older way. Interviews, timelines, receipts, mileage, weather, phone calls written down on message slips. You can almost hear the rotary click of an office phone, depending on the year you imagine the room, and you can feel the quiet pressure of a case that should have become clearer but did not. Each lead opened a little, then narrowed. Each person remembered something, then doubted part of it. Weeks became months in that soft, administrative way cases have. A folder becomes two folders. A box receives a label. The detective's handwriting appears less often, replaced by memos, lab slips, and copies of copies. If you run your thumb along the page edges, they feel uneven, some thick with attached forms, some thin as breath. The cold iron case was still alive, but it was learning the posture of waiting, and waiting changes a file. It changes the way people speak about it. Early on they say the case is active. Later they say it remains under review. Later still, someone says it has not been forgotten, and that phrase has its own sadness and its own dignity. You can hear the difference, can't you? The words become more careful. Nobody wants to promise too much. Nobody wants to let go. The detective who kept returning to the cold iron file understood that patience is not the same as passivity. Patience is active, though it often looks still from the outside. It is the decision to keep the folder within reach. It is the habit of rereading a statement when a new technique becomes available. It is the small lamp left on in a room where everyone else has gone home. Years later, something shifted in the file, not loudly, but with the quiet pressure of a page being turned after a very long pause. The evidence came back into view because someone asked about it again. That is often how old cases begin to breathe. Not through certainty, not through a dramatic confession, but through a question placed gently beside an old object. What exactly is this? Where was it found? Was it tested? Could it be tested now? You can see the cold case investigator sitting with the inventory sheet, one finger moving down the list, pausing at the item that had once seemed too minor. By then, the storage box had acquired the smell of years. Cardboard has a way of holding time. It takes in damp air, office dust, the trace of old glue, the faint sweetness of aging paper. Evidence tape yellows, labels fade, plastic sleeves turn slightly cloudy. Still, if the chain of custody has been respected, the past remains accessible, not perfectly, but enough. The cold iron case depended on that respect. Someone had sealed the item. Someone had written the number clearly. Someone had placed it where it could be found again. You may not know that person's name as you listen tonight, but their care matters. In cold cases, the quiet work of clerks, technicians, property officers, and junior investigators can become the bridge between one generation and the next. The strange evidence was examined again under better light, not metaphorical light at first, but actual light, lab light, white and steady, the kind that makes dust visible in the air and turns every surface plain. Under magnification, the material was not quite what early notes had assumed. Its texture told a different story. Its edges, its residue, its composition, all began to suggest a source more specific than anyone had understood when the case was young. You lean closer with the investigator now, not in alarm, but in attention. The report uses careful language. It doesn't overreach. It says consistent with. It says cannot exclude. It says further comparison recommended. These phrases may sound modest, but in patient detective work, modest phrases can open doors that bold guesses never could. The next step was comparison. That word is one of the quiet engines of investigation. Compare the fiber, compare the paint, compare the soil, compare the odd mark with a tool, a surface, a machine, a place. You take one small thing and ask whether it belongs to another small thing. Most of the time, the answer is no, but every no has value because it clears a little space around the truth. In the Coldiron case, comparison began to narrow the room. The evidence was linked not to a broad category, but to something more particular, a kind of object, a kind of work, a kind of place where such material might be found. Investigators returned to old statements, and the pages that had seemed flat began to gain depth. A casual mention from years before looked different now. A witness who had remembered an ordinary detail had perhaps remembered something important after all. This is why we move slowly tonight. The case asks for it. You turn back to the earlier interviews, and now the file feels subtly rearranged. No page has changed, yet your understanding has. A sentence about a workshop, a note about a vehicle, a description of dirt on a floor mat. Each one had been sitting there all along, mild and patient, waiting for the evidence to give it shape. The sound of the room becomes very quiet as you read. Somewhere beyond the file, a building settles. A heater clicks. The old paper barely whispers as the page turns. The human mind likes answers that arrive whole, but cases like Coldiron remind you that answers often arrive as alignment. One small fact lines up with another, then a third does. Then a forgotten note makes sense in a new way. There is still caution. There must be caution, but the shape begins to hold. Investigators traced the source suggested by the evidence. That meant returning to places already known, and sometimes to places that had never seemed worth much attention. You can imagine the work as almost humble. A phone call to confirm an address, a visit to a storage shed, a request for old employment records, a conversation with someone who says, at first, that it was all too long ago, then grows quiet and remembers the smell of machine oil, or the color of a truck, or the way a particular tool left marks behind. The Coldiron case did not solve itself in a single afternoon. Even when the strange evidence began pointing somewhere, every step still needed support. Detectives had to protect the case from wishful thinking. They had to ask whether the evidence could have arrived innocently. They had to consider contamination, coincidence, and the simple fact that old records can mislead when read too eagerly. So we sit with them there, in that careful middle place. It's a place every good investigation must pass through. Not ignorance anymore, but not certainty yet. The file is warmer now, perhaps because more hands have touched it again. New reports slide behind old ones. Fresh photographs join the faded prints. The smell of modern printer ink mixes with the older paper. and the case becomes a conversation across years. One of the older witnesses was contacted again. By then, their voice had changed with age, as voices do. The detective did not push. The questions were plain. Do you remember this object? Do you remember this place? Do you remember whether anyone mentioned it then? Memory after many years is fragile, and in a careful case, fragility is treated with respect. The witness remembered something small, not a grand statement, not a perfect scene, just a detail with a texture to it, a surface, a sound, the way something scraped when moved, the kind of detail that can stay in the mind because it belongs to the body, not only to thought. You know how that happens. You may forget a date, but remember the smell of wet wool in a hallway. You may forget a name, but remember the gritty feel of dust on a windowsill. That memory gave investigators another place to look. And when they looked, the strange evidence from the Coldiron case began to seem less strange, because it had found its setting. It belonged to a pattern of use. It belonged to an object that had been handled, repaired, moved, and perhaps taken for granted. What had seemed like a stray fragment became a quiet witness to contact. The file did not become loud. It became clearer. There is a difference, and it matters for the way we tell it tonight. Clarity, in a cold case, can feel almost tender because it arrives after so much uncertainty. It honors the people who waited. It honors the investigators who preserved small things. It honors the witnesses who tried to be honest about what they knew and what they did not know. As you sit with the Coldiron file, you begin to notice how much of the work is really about care. Care in labeling an envelope. Care in not exaggerating a result. Care in calling a family member with measured words. Care in admitting that a lead is only a lead, even when everyone wants it to be more. The patience is not empty. It is a form of respect. But there was one more detail in the evidence log, and it had been sitting close to the first one all along, quiet as dust on a sill. You draw that second envelope closer, and it makes the soft, papery rasp that old evidence envelopes make when they slide across a wooden desk. The label is written in a different hand from the first, narrower and more upright, as if another investigator had joined the Coldiron case after the first long season of uncertainty. Inside was a trace that looked almost domestic, almost too ordinary for a file that had carried so much weighting. It was a faint smear, not dramatic, not visually clear, but preserved because someone had believed that ordinary things deserve care. At the time, the smear was described in practical language. The note did not try to guess. It simply named the surface, where it had been found, the location in the room, and the way it had been lifted. You can feel the slight tackiness of the tape used to collect it, and you can imagine the technician lowering it slowly, pressing just enough, then easing it back. There is a kind of gentleness in that motion. Evidence can be damaged by impatience, and this technician was not impatient. For years, that second item remained a small sentence in the Coldiron case, tucked beneath longer reports and broader theories. It did not have the force of a witness statement. It did not point to a person by itself. It looked like residue from an ordinary life, the kind of trace a room gathers because people pass through rooms carrying dust, oils, soil, paper, and work on their hands. But when the first strange fragment began to matter, this second quiet trace became worth reading again. You can picture the cold case review beginning with a table cleared for one file at a time. The room is not glamorous. It has stackable chairs, a copier with a warm plastic smell, and blinds that tick softly when the air system starts. Someone brings the Coldiron boxes from storage, and for a while the case is not an old burden, but a present object again. The pages return to daylight. The names return to voices. The evidence numbers become a map. The The second item was tested with tools the original investigators had not been able to use in the same way. That is one of the quiet mercies of time in some cold cases. Time can take witnesses away, and it can blur memory, but it can also bring new methods to old rooms. A trace too mixed or too faint for one generation may become readable to another. You hold that thought gently, because it is not magic. It is labor, calibration, caution, and many people doing exact work under steady light. The report that came back did not use emotional language. Reports rarely do. It described elements, compounds, patterns, and comparisons. Yet behind those dry phrases, you can sense a door opening by a few inches. The residue appeared consistent with a particular environment, not common to every household, not random street dust, but something connected to a narrow kind of work. The cold iron case, which had once seemed spread across a wide and foggy field, began to contract around certain places. You return to the old interviews with that new result beside you. This is the part of detective work that looks almost like reading a book backward. A detail that meant little in the early pages begins to glow faintly later on. Someone had mentioned a smell. Someone else had described grit on a threshold. A third person had used a phrase that passed unnoticed then, because there was not yet a reason to pause. Now you pause. It was not only the material itself that mattered, it was where it was found. Placement is one of those patient facts that can change everything without raising its voice. Dust on a shoe means one thing. Dust inside a folded paper means another. A smear on a handle is not the same as a smear on a windowsill, and you learn to sit with these distinctions the way a careful detective does, quietly and without forcing them to speak faster than they can. The cold iron evidence log gave that placement in plain words. You can almost see the original scene photograph, its colors slightly washed by age, the flash catching a corner of varnished wood. The trace sits near the edge of use, not in the center, not where every hand would pass, but where a particular movement might have left it. The cold case investigator does not leap from that fact. They write it down again. They draw a small circle around it. They ask who would have touched that place, and why. A good question can make an old room feel present again. You stand there in the file, in the shape of the investigator's thought, and let the room rebuild itself from measurements and photographs. There is a chair angled slightly away from a table. There is a wall with a pale rectangle where something once hung. There is dust at the baseboard. There is the smell of old wood, floor polish and air that has been closed up too long. Nothing is hurried. The patient part is that every possible explanation must be allowed to exist for a while. Maybe the residue came from a repair. Maybe it belonged to a previous occupant. Maybe an officer or neighbor carried it in by accident. Maybe the placement means less than it seems. You don't brush those possibilities away, because the cold iron case had already waited too long for careless certainty. Instead, you let each possibility sit on the desk, separate and named. Then you test them. That testing begins with records, not with drama. Work orders, property files, old invoices, a maintenance note with a date written in a hurried hand. You can smell the dust that rises when a storage folder opens after years in a municipal basement. You can hear the soft slap of pages being squared against the table. The detective is looking for a reason that the residue might have arrived innocently, and that effort is not a detour. It is part of the truth. Several ordinary explanations fell away, not all at once, and not with any sense of triumph. They simply failed to match. A repair had used different material. A previous occupant had no known connection to the particular trace. A service call had happened months too early, and the surfaces involved did not line up. You can almost feel the case becoming narrower beneath your hands, as if the file itself is breathing a little more evenly. The next step brought investigators back to a name already inside the cold iron case. That is often how old evidence works. It does not always bring a stranger into view. Sometimes it returns you to someone who was always there, someone interviewed early, someone whose statement was filed, copied, and left in place. The name had not disappeared. It had simply waited without enough weight beside it. Now the evidence gave it weight. You turn to that statement slowly. The paper is thinner than the newer reports, and the type has the slightly uneven look of an older machine. The person had described their movements in ordinary terms, where they had been, who they had seen, what they remembered about the day. There was nothing in the statement that announced itself, but there was one mention of work, one reference to materials, one casual explanation for a stain or smell or object that seemed harmless at the time. In a cold case review, harmless details are treated with patience, not suspicion by default. That distinction matters. The detective is not trying to make a person fit the evidence. The detective is asking whether the evidence, the timeline, and the old words can stand beside each other without strain. You can imagine a legal pad filling with careful columns. Known. Unconfirmed. Needs follow-up. Possible innocent explanation. The pencil moves slowly, because slow is how this work stays honest. The Coldiron case had another peculiarity, and it was easy to miss unless you sat with the photographs for a long time. A mark on one surface appeared at first to be wear, the kind of scuff a person might make without noticing. It was not neat. It was not shaped like anything memorable. But when the strange fragment and the faint residue were considered together, the mark began to seem less random. It had a direction. It had pressure. It had a companion trace nearby. You can feel the investigator's body lean forward at that point, though the room remains quiet. There is no sharp music here, no sudden arrival, just a tension deepening. The photograph is enlarged, the contrast is adjusted. A ruler is placed beside a similar mark in a controlled comparison. Someone prints the image and lets it dry on the tray, and the warm ink smell briefly fills the office. Then the pages are laid side by side. Comparison can be meditative work. It asks the eye to notice shape, spacing, and habit. It asks the mind to resist seeing what it wants. The mark in the Coldiron case was compared with tools, objects, and surfaces connected to the narrow environment already suggested by the trace evidence. Most comparisons did not match well enough to matter. A few came close. One, quietly, came closer than the rest. Still, closer is not enough by itself. You know that by now, because the file has been teaching you. A match must be measured. A similarity must survive challenge. A hypothesis must endure the boring questions, the necessary questions, the ones that take the shine off a theory and leave only what can hold. Could another object make the same mark? Could the residue have come later? Could the fragment have been transferred by an innocent chain of contact? Those questions led investigators to reenact movements, not the painful heart of the case, but the ordinary mechanics of contact. How an object might be carried, how it might brush against a surface, how a residue might smear at one angle and flake at another. You can hear the quiet sounds of that testing. A tool laid down on paper, a chair leg moved an inch, a gloved hand lifting and replacing an item. The room smells of latex, paper, and coffee gone cold. The results did not shout. They accumulated. That is the central rhythm of the Coldiron case, and we stay with it because it is the rhythm of many patient investigations. One test adds a little weight. One interview removes a little doubt. One record corrects a mistaken assumption. The case does not leap, it settles. Like dust finding the lower shelf, like snow collecting on a sill, the evidence gathers where gravity takes it. There was also the matter of time. Not abstract time, but actual minutes, distances and habits. The old timeline had been built from statements, phone logs, and the ordinary schedules of people who believed the day would remain ordinary. When the evidence began pointing toward a specific environment and a specific possible source, the timeline had to be read again. You can see the detective drawing lines between places, noting drive times, waiting periods, and gaps that had once seemed too vague to use. Old maps have their own atmosphere. They fold badly after years. Their creases turn white. Some streets are printed in a faded red, some in grey, and landmarks appear under names that may have changed by the time the file is reopened. You smooth the cold iron map with both hands, and for a moment the case becomes geography. Not fear, not spectacle, just distance, turns, roads, and the human fact of where someone could be during a given span of time. The earlier timeline had allowed several possibilities. That is why the case remained unresolved for so long. Too many people could have been in too many places, and too many ordinary explanations could account for small inconsistencies. But the strange evidence acted like a weight placed gently on one side of the scale. It did not prove the whole matter alone. It made some explanations less likely, and one sequence more coherent. You turn back to the witness who remembered the small sensory detail. Their memory now has context. The smell they described, once dismissed as background, matched the kind of material found in the trace. The grit they noticed underfoot made sense in the same environment. Even their hesitation felt human rather than weak. They had not known why the detail mattered. They had simply carried it, somewhere in memory, until someone asked the right question. There is compassion in that too. Witnesses often live with the discomfort of not knowing whether they helped enough. They revisit their own words. They wonder whether they forgot something important. In the cold iron case, as in so many long investigations, the patient return to an old witness was not only procedural, it was human. It gave someone permission to offer a fragment without pretending it was more complete than it was. The case file thickened again. New statements were added. The lab reports were copied for review. A prosecutor, or someone in that role, began reading the material with a different kind of attention. Legal attention has its own texture. It is less about discovery and more about durability. What can be shown? What can be explained? What will remain clear when questioned by another careful person, months later or years later, in a room where every word matters? You can feel the shift in language as the cold iron case moves toward that stage. The notes become cleaner. The margins hold fewer private thoughts. Reports refer to exhibits, dates, and documented contact. The file is no longer only trying to understand the past. It is preparing to speak about the past in a way that can be tested. That preparation is slow, and in a sleep story like this, we can respect the slowness. The weird evidence was not weird because it was impossible. It was weird because it seemed misplaced, almost stubbornly ordinary in the wrong setting. That is a different kind of strangeness. It is the strangeness of finding a workshop trace in a quiet room, or a household residue on an object that should have been clean, or a fragment of specialized material resting where no one expected it. It whispers rather than calls, and because it whispers, you have to come close. The cold case team came close by building what investigators sometimes call a totality, though the word itself is heavier than the work feels while it's happening. Totality means the whole arrangement, not one fact standing alone, but the way facts lean toward each other, the fragment, the smear, the mark, the old statement, the timeline, the remembered smell, the narrow environment. Each piece still has its limits, but together they begin to form a steadier shape. At night, when you imagine the file resting beneath a desk lamp, that shape feels almost visible. The manila folders cast soft shadows. A paperweight holds down the map. A cup of tea cools near the edge, untouched because the reader forgot it was there. Outside, traffic has thinned. Inside, the cold iron case has become less like a riddle and more like a long conversation, finally reaching the sentence it had been trying to say. But investigators still had to find the source object. Without it, the evidence could suggest, support, and narrow, but the center remained partly open. The source object might have been discarded. It might have been sold, repaired, stored, or forgotten in a shed beneath tarps and old paint cans. Years are not kind to ordinary objects. They rust, they break, they are given away by relatives who do not know they matter. The search for it was quiet work. Records led to an address. The address led to a conversation. The conversation led to a memory of a storage space, and the storage space led, eventually, to a place that smelled of damp concrete, engine oil, and cardboard softened by weather. You can stand there with the investigators in your mind, not intruding, just observing. Light enters through a small dirty window. Dust moves when someone lifts a tarp. The object was not treated as an answer when it appeared. That restraint is important. It was treated as potential evidence. Photographed in place, logged, handled carefully, packaged so that loose material would not be lost. You can hear the click of the camera, the murmur of measurements being read aloud, the faint squeak of gloves against a plastic bag. The cold iron case had waited years for this moment, and still the moment had to move at the speed of procedure. Back at the lab, the comparison became more specific. The fragment from the original scene was examined beside the source material. The residue was considered with the object's use and condition. The mark was compared with edges, corners, or surfaces that might have produced it. No single observation carried the whole burden. Instead, the burden was shared. That is often what makes patient evidence strong. It does not ask one small fact to do too much. The report that followed was careful, but stronger than the earlier ones. It described consistencies that were not easily dismissed. It noted features that aligned in material, texture, and context. It explained limitations. It left space where science required space. Yet anyone reading it slowly could feel the cold iron case changing. The old uncertainty had not vanished, but it had been reduced. The room in which doubt could move had grown smaller. You turn the report over, and perhaps there is an attached photograph. The image is plain. It shows the original fragment beside a known sample, both enlarged until their surfaces become landscapes. Tiny ridges, dark flecks, a broken edge with a particular irregularity. It is strange how small things can become vast when the question is old enough. Under magnification, a forgotten speck can look like a map of everything investigators missed and everything they preserved. The people who had waited for answers were not given poetry. They were given careful language. That is as it should be. Families and communities deserve truth without ornament. When investigators explained the development, they likely did it slowly, making clear what had changed and what had not. You can imagine the quiet on the other end of the phone, or in a small office, as someone absorbs the fact that an old piece of evidence has begun to speak more clearly. There is no need to dramatize that moment. The dignity is already there. The cold iron case was moving now, because the evidence had joined the human record. A physical trace supported a remembered detail. A remembered detail clarified a statement connected to a place led back to an object. The object gave the lab something known, something firm enough for comparison. This is how patient investigation can feel when seen from above, though from inside it feels like many ordinary days, many small calls, many pages turned. One of the most important parts of this stage was exclusion. That word can sound negative, but it is a gift. To exclude is to spare the case from confusion. Investigators compared the evidence with other possible sources, including sources that would have made the case simpler in another direction. When those did not fit, the conclusion did not become more exciting. It became more responsible. You can feel the relief of that, quiet and professional, like a breath released through the nose. As the cold iron case narrowed, the old alibi material had to be revisited. Alibis in cold files are often made of ordinary things: a receipt, a phone message, a remembered visit, a neighbor's statement, a note on a calendar. They can be sincere and still incomplete. They can be accurate in one part and mistaken in another. You sit with them gently, because behind every alibi document is a person trying to place a life in order after time has passed. The new evidence did not simply erase the old timeline. It refined it. A receipt once thought to cover a wider period covered only a purchase time. A statement once believed to account for an afternoon turned out to account for part of it. A distance once assumed to be too great was recalculated using older road conditions, not modern traffic patterns. These are quiet corrections. They do not sparkle, they matter. You can hear the pencil again, moving across a fresh sheet. Time window, confirmed, unconfirmed, travel possible, contact possible, evidence consistent. The words are plain, but they carry years of work. In the Coldiron case, the weird evidence had given investigators permission to remeasure old assumptions, not to bend them, to measure them. That difference is the heart of patient detective work. There was also a record that had been overlooked because it belonged to another system. Not hidden, not secret, just stored elsewhere. A municipal form, a business document, a repair ledger, something with carbon copies, perhaps. The lower sheet faint and bluish, the letters slightly soft around the edges. When the cold case team found it, it did not solve anything by itself. It simply placed the source object, or material like it, near the person already coming back into view. You can imagine the feeling of finding such a document. Not excitement exactly, more like recognition. The page has been waiting in a different box, under a different label, in a different building where the air smells of dust and old carpet. Someone signs it out. Someone scans it. Someone compares its date with the timeline. The Coldiron case grows one page heavier and one uncertainty lighter. The phrase weird evidence can make a thing sound almost whimsical. But in this file, its importance came from patience. It was weird only because nobody understood its place at first. Once the place became clear, it looked less like an oddity and more like a remnant of contact, a small physical memory left behind, when human memory could not carry everything. That is a gentle way to think about evidence, not as drama, as memory held by matter. Matter remembers differently from people. It does not remember meaning. It remembers pressure, transfer, contact, heat, moisture, and time. It remembers by changing. A fiber breaks, a surface scratches, a residue dries, a fragment clings to tape. People must interpret those changes, and people can be wrong, which is why careful procedure matters so much. But when procedure is patient, matter can help restore a little shape to the past. The next interview with the person connected to the evidence was conducted with that patience. You can picture a small room with a table, a recorder, and 2 cups of water. The questions were likely direct, but not theatrical. Investigators would have asked about the object, the material, the place, and the timing. They would have listened for explanations that fit the new facts. They would have allowed pauses, because pauses are not proof of anything. Pauses are simply human. Old statements were compared to new answers. That comparison is one of the quietest forms of pressure in an investigation. Not raised voices, not accusation as performance. Just the steady presence of the record. Years earlier, you said this. The evidence now shows that. Can you help us understand the difference? The Coldiron case, after so much waiting, could finally ask more exact questions. The answers did not remove every shadow at once. They rarely do. But some explanations strained against the physical evidence. Others contradicted records that had been found later. A timeline that had once looked flexible became less forgiving. You can feel the file's center of gravity shifting again, not toward spectacle, but toward accountability. The small fragment, the faint smear, and the quiet mark had done what patient evidence does. They had made vagueness harder to maintain. Still, the investigators had to proceed in the proper order. They needed review. They needed corroboration. They needed the lab work to be clear enough for someone outside the investigation to understand. They needed the old chain of custody examined line by line. If a case has waited years, it cannot be rushed at the very moment it begins to move. You can sense the discipline in that. It is almost restful, in its own way. The chain of custody pages in the Coldiron file are not the pages most people would choose to read first. They are lists of transfers, signatures, dates and storage locations. Yet tonight, those pages deserve our attention. They are the quiet proof that the small thing stayed itself through time. From scene to envelope, from envelope to property room, from property room to lab, from lab back to storage. Each signature is a small act of continuity. You can see the ink changing over the years. Blue pen, black pen, a stamp, a barcode added later. Initials written quickly by someone who handled hundreds of items in a month and could not have known which one would matter decades later. The Coldiron case depended on those ordinary marks. Without them, the strange evidence might have remained interesting but fragile. With them, it could stand in the room with the rest of the proof. A retired investigator was also contacted during the review. That happens sometimes when old files reopen. The people who began the work may be living different lives by then, their desks cleared, their badges stored, their memories carrying both details and weather. You can imagine the phone call reaching a quiet kitchen, or a garage, or a porch, where late afternoon light lies across the floor. The name Coldiron is spoken, and the past rises slowly. The retired investigator did not have to remember everything to help. The file held the facts. What they could offer was context. Why one lead had been followed, why another had gone quiet, which witness seemed certain, which detail bothered them in a way they could never quite justify. Sometimes that kind of unease is not evidence, but it can explain why something was preserved. It can tell you where care entered the file. They remembered the small item, perhaps not perfectly, but enough to say it had seemed out of place. That phrase appears often in patient investigations. Out of place. It means the mind noticed a mismatch before the tools could explain it. A smell where it shouldn't be. A texture that didn't belong. A mark too fresh for an old surface. In the Coldiron case, the old instinct and the new science finally met across the years. You sit with that meeting for a moment. It is one of the calmer beauties of cold case work. The first detective did not solve it alone. The lab did not solve it alone. The witness did not solve it alone. The future did not replace the past. Instead, each part held something until the others were ready. The file became a place where care accumulated. By then, the Coldiron case had likely moved into a more formal phase. Warrants may have been sought, additional items may have been collected, statements may have been recorded again with exact references to the evidence. Every step had to be documented, because the case had become not only an investigation, but a structure that would need to hold weight. You can imagine the file boxes multiplying, each label written with the same name, each one carrying a different layer of time. The weird evidence continued to guide the questions. Where else might this material appear? Who had access to it? When did they have access? Could it transfer through clothing, tools, vehicles, or storage? Was there evidence of that kind of transfer elsewhere? These are not dramatic questions, but they are absorbing in the quiet way a puzzle can be absorbing when no one is asking you to hurry. You follow them one at a time. A vehicle became part of the review. In many old cases, vehicles are difficult because they change hands, break down, disappear, or get stripped for parts. But records can remain after metal is gone. Registration forms, insurance papers, repair notes, a witness memory of a seat cover or floor mat. In the Coldiron case, the material evidence made investigators look again at transportation, not as an abstract route, but as a place where trace could move. You can smell the inside of an old vehicle in the file, even if the vehicle itself is only a photograph now. Vinyl warmed by sun. Dust in the vents. A faint oil smell in the footwell. Loose grit caught in the seams of a mat. The lab may have had only preserved samples, or perhaps a related item stored elsewhere, but the question was the same. Did the environment of that vehicle connect to the evidence from the original scene? The answer was not simple, and that is why it belongs here. Some traces were too common. Some were degraded. Some could not be dated with the precision anyone would have wished. But one comparison supported the emerging pattern. Not enough alone. Never alone. Enough to matter beside everything else. You begin to see how the Coldiron case was solved, not by one weird item, but by the way that item led patiently to its companions. This is an important distinction. People often remember the oddest evidence because it gives the story a handle. But in the file, the odd evidence is more like a thread. You pull it carefully, and it leads beneath ordinary layers. It passes under records, interviews, maps, and lab work. If pulled too hard, it breaks. If followed with patience, it can show how the fabric was woven. The investigators followed it through old property records next. The source object had a history, and that history placed it in certain hands at certain times. You can imagine the paperwork spread across a long table, dates circled lightly, names connected by thin pencil lines. Some connections were irrelevant. Some were too distant. One connection sat close to the Coldiron timeline, close enough that the investigators returned to it more than once. A neighbor's statement then became newly important. The neighbor had not claimed certainty. They had described a small observation, perhaps a sound in the evening, perhaps the movement of an object, perhaps the sight of someone carrying something that did not seem memorable until later. In the early investigation, it was one more fragment among many. In the renewed Coldiron case, it fit beside the material trace with a quiet click. You can hear that click, though it is not a sound in the room. It is the inward sound of alignment. The detective reads the neighbor's words, then reads the lab report, then looks at the map. The office is still. The clock on the wall has a tired tick. Somewhere, a printer starts and stops. The case does not announce that it is solved. It simply becomes harder to misunderstand. The neighbor was approached again with care. Years had passed, and the investigator knew better than to demand perfect memory. The question was not whether the neighbor could become certain now. The question was whether their old statement had been recorded accurately, and whether anything about the newly understood evidence helped them recall the context. You can feel the kindness in asking that way. It allows memory to be partial, without being useless. Their answer was modest. That modesty made it stronger. They did not add a dramatic new scene. They did not claim more than they had first seen. They confirmed the old detail and clarified one small point about direction, timing, or object shape. In the Coldiron case, that was enough to place another quiet stone in the path. Not a boulder, a stone. Patient cases are often built that way. The cold case team then brought the timeline, the trace evidence, the source object, and the witness statements into a single review. You can picture the meeting room after hours. Copies arranged in stacks. Sticky notes curling slightly at the corners. A whiteboard with names written plainly, not as villains or heroes, but as people in a record. The air smells faintly of dry marker and cooled coffee. Someone closes the door gently. They walked through it from the beginning. This is not a summary, not in the way a listener might expect a story to fold itself neatly. It is a method. Start with what was known. Add what was preserved. Add what changed through new testing. Remove what could not be supported. Note what remains uncertain. Do not fill gaps with desire. The Coldiron case had waited too long for desire to be allowed near the steering wheel. As they walked through it, the weird evidence appeared at several points rather than one. That was its strength. It connected the location to a material. It connected the material to an object. It connected the object to a person's known environment. It helped refine time and movement. It supported one witness and challenged another explanation. Evidence that appears only once can be important, but evidence that reappears across the structure becomes steadier. You notice, as you sit with the file, that the investigation has a softness despite its seriousness. Not softness in standards, softness in pace. The work respects the fact that real lives are involved. Nobody in the file is a plot device. The victim is not reduced to the case. The witnesses are not reduced to their usefulness. Even the person under scrutiny is treated through evidence, not theatrical certainty. That is the tone we keep tonight. Calm does not mean indifferent. It means we have no need to raise our voice over what the facts can carry. The Coldiron case is old enough to have acquired echoes, but the file itself remains practical. It asks what was found. It asks what can be known. It asks who waited, who remembered, who preserved, and who returned. Another laboratory step examined whether the trace could have been transferred indirectly. This mattered deeply. If the material could move easily from one place to another through casual contact, its value would be limited. If it required more specific contact, its meaning would sharpen. The testing involved controlled samples, surfaces, pressure, and movement. You can imagine the quiet repetition, the gloved hands, the labeled trays, the small piles of material weighed and documented. The results suggested that the trace did not appear in that location easily by accident. Again, the report was careful. It did not close every door, but it made the innocent transfer explanation narrower. In the Coldiron case, narrowing was progress. A cold file is often a landscape of too many open paths. The patient investigator does not need to block them all at once. They need only learn which paths no longer lead anywhere. That finding returned attention to the original scene processing. If the item had been collected poorly, the new result would be less useful. So the team reviewed photographs, logs, and notes from the first responders and technicians. You can see them checking times, positions, packaging, and whether similar material had been visible elsewhere. The old photographs were enlarged until the grain appeared. The paper copies may have smelled faintly chemical, like aging photo stock kept in a sleeve. The original work held up better than anyone might have feared. That is worth pausing over. It means someone, long ago, did the careful thing without knowing the future would need it. They photographed before moving. They labeled before storing. They noted location before interpretation. In the Coldiron case, that early discipline became a gift sent forward through time. You turn another page, and the case becomes quieter for a while. There are stretches in every investigation where progress is mostly waiting. Waiting for a lab queue, waiting for a records request, waiting for a retired employee to return a call, waiting for a prosecutor's review, waiting while the file sits in a locked drawer, no less important for being still. Sleep has something in common with that kind of waiting. It trusts that not everything must be held consciously at once. During one of those waiting periods, an investigator returned to the photographs for no immediate reason except familiarity. That happens when a case lives in the mind. You look again because the file has become a room you know, and sometimes rooms reveal small things only after you have stopped demanding they do. The Coldiron photographs showed the same surfaces, the same angles, the same muted colors, but now one background detail seemed worth checking. It was an object partly visible near the edge of a frame, not the central evidence, not the marked item. Just something in the room that might explain how the strange trace was deposited, or might show that it did not belong there at all. The investigator enlarged it, then compared it to inventory notes. There was no immediate answer, only another small question. And sometimes a small question is enough to keep a patient case alive. The object led to an old property list. The list led to a missing description. The missing description led someone to ask whether all items from the scene had been accounted for. You can feel the paper trail becoming delicate here. Old forms may have been incomplete. Some items may have been returned, discarded, or photographed without being kept. None of that is unusual. It simply means the investigator has to move slowly, checking each step against the next. In the Coldiron case, the edge-of-frame object turned out not to be the source of the trace, but it helped clarify the room's ordinary contents. That mattered because ordinary contents define what is out of place. A room has its own ecosystem of dust, fabric, tools, habits, and surfaces. To know what doesn't belong, you have to know what does. The file was not only identifying evidence, it was learning the room. That phrase feels right for old casework. Learning the room, learning the road, learning the habits of a day long past. You do not enter as a stranger and demand answers. You sit. You notice where the light would have fallen. You consider which door was used most. You listen to the witness who says the floor always creaked in one spot. You let the Coldiron case become specific enough to be fair. Specificity is a kindness. It prevents people from becoming shadows. It prevents evidence from becoming symbols. It asks us to stay with the real scale of things. A desk, a handle, a smear, a 10-minute window written as words in a notebook, a person who made a statement and then went home carrying the weight of having said all they could say. The investigation is large only because these small things matter. By the time the review was complete enough for action, the Coldiron case had become a layered record of patience. The first layer was the immediate work, imperfect but careful. The second was years of preservation, the file waiting without disappearing. The third was new science, new comparison, new access to records. The fourth was the human willingness to ask old questions again without embarrassment. That willingness is more important than it sounds. Some cases stay unsolved longer because people assume everything useful has already been done. The file becomes familiar, and familiarity can become a kind of sleep. In the Coldiron case, someone resisted that. Someone looked at the weird evidence and treated it not as a curiosity, but as an unfinished sentence. You can almost see the moment they wrote a note in the margin. Recheck, compare, source. The words are simple. The effect was lasting. The legal threshold, once reached, would have required more than atmosphere and alignment. It required probable cause, supported by facts that could be named, the material trace, the source comparison, the refined timeline, the statements that matched better than they used to, the explanations that no longer held. The Coldiron case became something that could be carried outside the quiet room and into the formal machinery of accountability. Even then, the tone of the work remained careful. An arrest, if it came, was not the same as an answer for every question. A charge, if filed, did not erase the years of not knowing. The people connected to the case still had to live with the long delay, the old grief, the memories of being told there was no update. Patient detective work can bring resolution in a legal sense, while still leaving human feelings more complicated and tender than any document can capture. You remain with the file, because the file is where the patience is visible. A public announcement might compress years into a few sentences. The file does not. It shows the waiting. It shows the wrong turns. It shows the lab requests that returned little. It shows the witness who tried twice to remember a detail and could not. It shows the evidence envelope that sat quietly until the right comparison existed. That is the fuller story. The strange evidence had one more role after it helped identify the path forward. It helped explain why the case had been so difficult in the first place. The trace was not obvious. The source was not common enough to be recognized casually, yet not so rare that it named a person immediately. The mark was visible but ambiguous. The witness memory was sensory, not declarative. Each element was almost useful before it became truly useful. Almost useful evidence can be haunting to investigators. You sense that in old files. A note underlined, a question repeated, a photograph printed twice. The people working the Coldiron case may have felt, even early on, that something in the physical record was trying to matter. But trying is not enough. Evidence must become understandable. The years gave it that chance, though the waiting was heavy. You can imagine the detective from the early phase receiving news of the development. Perhaps they sit silently for a moment. Perhaps they ask which item. Perhaps they remember the envelope before they remember the report. There is a private satisfaction in knowing that care was not wasted. Not celebration, exactly. More like the settling of a long-held breath. The small thing kept safe had finally become useful. For the family, the movement of the Coldiron case would have felt different. Investigative progress is not abstract when it touches a life. It may bring relief, but also reopen old rooms of memory. A name returning to the news can stir years that had been carefully folded away. The patient narrator in us must respect that. We do not turn their waiting into entertainment. We simply acknowledge that behind every preserved trace is someone who deserved an answer sooner. That is why the calm matters. Calm is a form of respect here. It leaves room around the facts. It lets the listener, and you as the quiet detective tonight, sit with what happened without being pushed into alarm. The evidence is enough. The years are enough. The care is enough. The Coldiron case does not need anything sharpened beyond recognition. The next pages describe expert review. A second analyst looked at the findings. Independent review helps protect old cases from the danger of a single hopeful reading. You can picture another lab bench, another microscope, another person who knows the case mostly through samples and reports. Their task is not to echo the first conclusion. Their task is to test it, to see whether the same quiet pattern remains when a fresh set of trained eyes looks closely. The pattern remained, not perfectly in every detail, because real evidence is rarely perfect, but enough. Enough consistency in material, enough support from placement, enough relationship to the known source, enough connection to the timeline and statements. The Coldiron case had become sturdy through repetition, not through force. Every careful confirmation made the structure less dependent on any single point. You may notice how often the word enough appears in patient investigations. It is not a glamorous word. It is a legal word, a practical word, and sometimes a merciful one. Enough to proceed, enough to exclude, enough to compare, enough to ask again. In old cases, enough can be hard-won. It can take years to gather. It can rest inside small envelopes until the world learns how to read them. The file then moved between desks, investigator to supervisor, supervisor to prosecutor, prosecutor back to investigator with questions. This back and forth can feel slow, but it is part of the care. Each desk adds scrutiny. Each question tests the case. You can hear the quiet rhythm of office life around it. Keyboards, distant phones, paper trays, the soft closing of a file drawer. The Coldiron case is no longer forgotten, but it is still being handled with both hands. One question concerned motive, though motive was not what solved the evidence. Motive can help explain, but physical evidence can stand even when motive is incomplete. The investigators reviewed relationships, conflicts, routines, and prior statements, all with the same measured pace. You do not need to dwell in emotional heat to understand that human lives are complicated. The file does not ask us to judge feelings. It asks us to follow what can be known. The weird evidence remained the steadier guide. It did not speculate about motives. It did not interpret expressions. It did not guess at intention. It simply connected contact, material, object, place, and time. There is something almost restful about that, if you are listening late at night. The evidence has no mood. The investigators bring the care. Together, they make a path. At some point, the The person connected to the evidence may have been confronted with the fuller pattern, not one piece. The pattern, the old statement, the new test, the source object, the timeline, the witness memory, and the exclusions. A careful investigator lays these out plainly. The room is quiet enough that the recorder's small red light seems bright. There is water on the table. There are long pauses. No one needs to perform certainty because the documents are doing their work. What happens in such interviews varies. Sometimes a person denies everything. Sometimes they admit a small fact that confirms a larger structure. In the Coldiron case, the evidence had made certain denials difficult to sustain. The facts had narrowed the space. You can feel that narrowing without making it harsh. It is simply what happens when patient work removes the places where confusion used to hide. A revised explanation was checked, as all explanations must be. The investigators did not reject it because it was inconvenient, and they did not accept it because it was available. They tested it against the material, the timeline, and the old statements. It failed in places that mattered. The source object could not be where the explanation needed it to be. The trace could not easily arrive by the route suggested. The timing did not stretch far enough. These are quiet failures. No one needs to raise a voice over them. The file records them in normal sentences. Explanation inconsistent with known evidence. Timeline unsupported. Transfer route unlikely. Such phrases may seem dry, but after years of uncertainty, dryness can be a kind of strength. It means the case is leaving the realm of impression and entering the realm of documented reason. The Coldiron case also required investigators to consider whether the evidence had been planted, moved, or contaminated after discovery. Those questions can feel uncomfortable, but they are necessary. A careful case welcomes them. The storage records were checked again. The original scene photos were reviewed. The packaging was examined. The lab notes were compared for any inconsistency. You can almost smell the paper dust rising once more as the chain of custody pages are opened. No meaningful break appeared. The evidence had a traceable path. The item was visible in the original context. The collection note matched the photograph. The packaging dates aligned. These things sound administrative, and they are, but they are also the reason the strange evidence could be trusted. In a patient investigation, trust is not a feeling. It is built from signatures, timestamps, photographs, and procedures followed when no one knew they would become important. By now, the file has a different weight in your hands. It is no longer only a mystery, it is a record of transformation. Old uncertainty becoming structured, small evidence becoming meaningful, human memory joining physical trace, years of waiting becoming useful rather than empty. The Coldiron case is still quiet, but quiet does not mean still anymore. The pages have begun to move toward consequence, and yet, even consequence arrives slowly in this kind of telling. There are court filings to prepare, expert summaries to refine, exhibits to label, and family notifications to handle with care. There are old photographs to digitize and new diagrams to make. There are dates to check in spoken form, so nobody confuses the 9th with the 19th, or an afternoon with an evening. The work is precise, because people deserve precision. You can imagine an evidence board, though perhaps by then it was digital. The Coldiron name at the top, photographs arranged by location, reports linked to item numbers, timeline entries placed along a calm horizontal line. The weird evidence appears not as a curiosity, but as a central node, connected by thin lines to object, source, witness, and time. It looks almost simple when arranged that way, but simplicity at the end often hides great patience. The case's patient center remains the same. Someone kept a small thing safe. That thought returns again and again. An investigator, or technician, or property officer, working under ordinary conditions, preserved what did not yet make sense. Years later, another person had the humility to ask whether it might make sense now. Between those two acts lies the whole bridge of the Coldiron case. Care at the beginning, care at the return. As you turn the next page, The file enters the part where evidence becomes language for others. Lab findings have to be translated without being weakened. Technical terms have to be explained without being inflated. A jury, judge, or reviewing authority cannot be asked to accept mystery as proof. They must be shown the path step by step. The best cold case work is patient enough to make its own reasoning visible. So the investigators prepared to explain the fragment first. Where it was found, how it was collected, why it was initially difficult to identify, what later testing showed, how the known source was located, why the comparison mattered. You can hear the measured cadence of that explanation, almost like the cadence of our narration tonight. A fact, then context. A limit, then support. A question, then the answer. The evidence can responsibly give. Then they prepared to explain the residue, its location, its composition, its relationship to the same environment. The failed innocent explanations, the way it supported, rather than duplicated, the fragment evidence. That distinction matters. Supporting evidence does not need to say the same thing in the same voice. It only needs to stand in the same room and point in the same direction, calmly, without contradiction. Then came the mark, the scuff or pressure trace that had once seemed too ordinary. It was explained with photographs, comparison samples, and careful language about likelihood. The mark was not asked to solve the case alone. It was asked to show contact consistent with the other findings. In the Coldiron case, every piece had a modest job. That modesty made the whole stronger. You may feel, as the file moves through this preparation, that the mystery is becoming less misty, but not less human. That is the balance we want. The facts clarify. The compassion stays. The old room becomes more understandable, but the years do not disappear. The people who waited still waited. The investigators who wondered still wondered. The evidence did not give those years back. It only gave them meaning. There was likely a moment when the cold case team looked at the full record and understood that the weird evidence had done all it could do. It had led them to the object. It had supported the timeline. It had challenged false explanations. It had joined the witness memories and the records. Now the rest belonged to process, law, and the careful telling of what had been found. You can imagine that moment as very still. The office at the end of such a day has a particular feeling. The lights seem too bright over the empty desks. The carpet holds the day's footsteps. A file box sits closed, but not forgotten. Someone writes one final note before leaving, perhaps just a reminder for the next morning. Call lab. Confirm exhibit list. Send report. The Coldiron case, after so many years, has become tomorrow's work again. That is a gentle place to rest for a moment, because tomorrow's work is how old cases are truly solved. Not in a burst, not in a single flash of certainty, in the return, in the willingness to come back after sleep, after doubt, after the lab says wait, after the records office says the archive is incomplete. You come back because the file is still there, and because somewhere inside it, a small piece of evidence has not finished speaking. The next morning in the file, if we let ourselves imagine it, begins with ordinary sounds. A key in a door, a light switch, the rustle of a coat being hung over a chair. The first page opened again, even though everyone knows what it says. The Coldiron case sits on the desk, heavier than before, and the investigator begins checking the exhibit list against the boxes one more time, because one more time is how careful work becomes reliable. The exhibit list has its own quiet discipline, and you follow it line by line as if each entry were a step across a dimly lit room. Item 1, the original fragment. Item 2, the trace lift. Item 3, the photographs that fixed them in place before anyone knew what they might become. The Coldiron case is no longer only a file to be studied, but a set of things that must travel carefully from storage to explanation, from explanation to understanding. A property officer checks the seals, and the old tape has that dry, slightly glossy look of adhesive that has aged under steady air. The signatures are compared. The dates are read aloud. The boxes are not opened casually, because evidence deserves a slower kind of handling. You can almost feel the quiet focus in the room, the way people lower their voices without being asked when the past is placed on a table. One small problem appears, as small problems often do. A label on a secondary sleeve is faded, and the item number has to be confirmed against the log. Nothing is missing, nothing is broken, but the moment requires attention. The Coldiron case has taught everyone by now that small things matter, so the property officer does not wave it away. They compare handwriting, storage location, and original inventory notes until the number settles back into certainty. That is the texture of careful work. Not drama, but verification. A person reads a number twice. Another person checks the photograph. A third notes the confirmation in a clean hand. You sit with them in that plain room and feel the odd comfort of procedure, because procedure is the way an old case keeps its balance after years of uncertainty. It may seem slow, but slow is the point. The weird evidence, once nearly invisible in the Coldiron case, now had to be made understandable to people who had never held the file. That required a kind of translation, not simplifying until the meaning was lost, and not making the science so dense that the human shape disappeared. Investigators and experts had to explain how a tiny physical trace could connect place, object, and person, while still being honest about what it could not say. You can imagine an expert preparing notes at a desk with a microscope nearby and a half-finished cup of coffee growing cool. The language is adjusted again and again. Consistent with becomes more specific where the data allows it. Cannot exclude remains where caution requires it. The expert knows that certainty is not a tone of voice. Certainty must be earned by method, and anything short of certainty must be named with equal care. In the Coldiron case, the fragment had an origin story that now mattered. It was not just a crumb of dark material. It had a surface, a break pattern, and a composition that tied it to a particular kind of object and use. The source object, found later, gave investigators a known sample, and the comparison gave the old trace a home. That word, home, is not forensic language, of course, but in the quiet of the file, it feels right. The trace lift had its own smaller story. The residue carried the environment of contact. It suggested that the same kind of material, or the same working place, had reached a surface where it should not have been. You can picture the old adhesive strip under clear film, a faint cloudy mark preserved like breath on glass. Most people would pass over it. A patient investigator does not pass over it. A patient investigator asks why the breath is there. The mark or scuff, the third companion in the pattern, helped show motion. It suggested that something with the right edge, weight, or surface had met the room in a particular way. Again, the file does not ask the mark to speak louder than it can. It asks only that it join the others. In the Coldiron case, that joining was the point. Strange evidence became strong evidence because it did not stand alone. The first formal review of the full evidence package must have felt almost ceremonial, though nobody would have called it that. A conference table, a prosecutor with a yellow pad, investigators with binders, lab reports clipped in order, photographs placed where everyone could see them. The room smells of printer toner, dry paper, and the faint polish of a table wiped down before the meeting. Outside the windows, an ordinary day moves on. You sit at that table in the role the story gives you tonight, the quiet detective rereading the Coldiron case by lamplight. You are not rushing ahead. You are noticing how the evidence gains force through sequence. First, collection, then preservation, then renewed testing, then source identification, then comparison, then timeline support. Each step is modest, and each one waits for the next before claiming more than it should. One question in the room would have been whether the case could be explained clearly without leaning too heavily on technical awe. That matters. Jurors, judges, families, and the public all deserve plain speech. Science can become a fog if handled poorly. In a patient case, the better path is often the simpler one. Here is the object. Here is the trace. Here is where it was found. Here is why that location matters. The Coldiron case became clearer when explained through ordinary contact. A thing was used. A thing left material behind. That material appeared where it did not belong. A person connected to the thing had given an account that did not fit the material once the material was understood. This is not theatrical. It is almost humble. It is also why the evidence mattered after so many quiet years. There were still gaps, because old cases nearly always keep some. The exact moment of transfer may not have been visible. The full sequence of movements may have remained partly inferred. Some witness memories may have stayed incomplete. But a case does not require every shadow to be erased before it can move forward. It requires enough light to show the path. And in the Coldiron file, that light came from small places. A detective might have written a new summary then, not for the public, but for the case team. Such summaries have a restrained tone. They begin with the original incident, then note the evidence preserved, the limitations of early testing, the later review, and the new findings. You can hear the pages turning as the summary is drafted. The sentences are exact. The verbs are chosen with care. The Coldiron case had waited too long for careless writing. Careless writing can harm a case almost as much as careless collection. A vague phrase can make a fact appear weaker. An overconfident phrase can make a careful conclusion seem suspect. So the words are weighed, material recovered from the scene, subsequent analysis, comparative features, known source, timeline inconsistency. These are not bedtime words in themselves, perhaps, but beneath them is the slow comfort of order being restored. The old witness statements were placed beside the new findings, and once again you can feel the case drawing breath through comparison. One witness had mentioned a sound. Another remembered a surface being marked. Another recalled that the person later connected to the evidence had access to a place where such material was used. Each statement remained partial. Together, they gave the physical evidence a human setting. You can imagine the investigators revisiting one witness in person, because some conversations are better handled face to face. The visit is quiet. A porch, a kitchen table, a folder kept closed until needed. The witness is older now, and maybe they apologize for not remembering more. The detective tells them the truth gently. What you remembered then still matters. What you can confirm now is enough. You do not need to fill what you don't know. There is relief in being told that. People often fear memory like a failing machine, when really it is more like a room where some things remain in place and others have been moved. A smell may remain, a sound may remain, a date may vanish. In the Coldiron case, the evidence helped investigators know which memories to treat as anchors and which to leave as open water. One of the witness details concerned texture. That may seem minor, but texture lives close to memory. Roughness, grit, a powdery feel on fingertips. The witness had described something like that without knowing its relevance. Years later, the lab result gave the texture a name. You can feel the quiet convergence there. The human body noticed what the investigation could not yet explain. The evidence waited until explanation became possible. A second witness gave less, and that mattered too. They could not confirm a point that investigators might have liked to confirm. A weaker storyteller would turn away from that. A careful detective keeps it. Non-confirmation is part of the record. It prevents the case from becoming neater than life. The Coldiron file, at its strongest, did not pretend every person remembered exactly what was needed. It built only with what would hold. The suspect's earlier words, preserved in the first round of interviews, were then placed under renewed attention. We can use the word suspect calmly here, because at this stage the evidence had focused. The old statement was not dramatic. It sounded like someone explaining an ordinary day, but ordinary days can be tested. The places named, the times given, the objects mentioned, the work described, all had to stand beside the weird evidence now. Some parts stood, others did not. That is how statements often behave. A person may tell a truth around one part and avoid another. A person may remember selectively. A person may believe a detail helps them when it quietly creates another problem. The Coldiron investigators could not read minds, and did not need to. They read the file. They read the trace. They read the records that time had left behind. There was an old receipt connected to the suspect's timeline, and it became newly important in a limited way. It proved one location at one time, but not a whole afternoon. That distinction had been blurred in the early investigation because the case then had too many uncertainties. Now the distinction mattered. You can see the receipt under a clear sleeve. Ink fading, edges curled. It is both useful and modest, which is exactly what evidence often is. The receipt narrowed nothing by itself, but it stopped protecting more time than it could honestly protect. The Coldiron case required that kind of correction. A document must not be allowed to do work it cannot do. A witness must not be allowed to do work it cannot do. A witness must not be asked to remember more than they can. A lab result must not become a confession. Each piece has its proper size, and patient investigation is the art of keeping pieces at their proper size. Another record showed access to the source environment during the relevant period. That was more significant. It connected the suspect to the kind of material that appeared in the trace. It did not prove contact with the scene alone, but it made the contact more explainable through a particular route. You can imagine the investigators placing this record next to the lab report, then leaving space between them for the questions that still needed answering. The record may have been a work assignment, a service invoice, or an inventory note. Its exact form matters less here than the function it served in the file. It gave date, place, and access. Those are quiet pillars. They hold up a great deal when combined with physical trace and inconsistent statements. The Coldiron case was becoming less dependent on memory and more grounded in things that had been written before anyone knew they would matter. That is one of the deep strengths of old records. They are often created for dull reasons: billing, scheduling, maintenance, employment, delivery. Because they were not created to explain a mystery, they can have a plain reliability when used carefully. You sit with that idea as the file turns. The past was documenting itself in routine ways, never knowing that one day a detective would follow those routine marks back toward an answer. The investigators also had to consider whether someone else with similar access could have left the evidence. This is where patient detective work becomes broad again for a while. The case narrows, then widens, then narrows. Other people with access are identified. Their locations are checked. Their statements are reviewed. Their connection to the scene is considered. You can feel the file expanding but not losing shape. Most of those alternate paths ended quietly. One person had no link to the room, another had access to the material, but not the time window. Another had a possible route, but no supporting statement, no mark, no residue placement, no inconsistency in the earlier record. The Coldiron case did not eliminate alternatives by preference. It eliminated them by work. That is the only way elimination can be trusted. The suspect's path remained because it held several points at once: access to the material, opportunity within the refined timeline, a statement that failed under comparison, a possible source object later recovered, trace evidence in a place that required explanation, witness details that supported, without overstating. This is the kind of alignment that makes a cold case move after years of stillness. The next phase involved preparing exhibits, so the weird evidence could be seen without being misunderstood. Enlargements can help, but they can also distort importance if presented carelessly. A tiny fragment shown large may seem more dramatic than it is. A patient expert explains scale. They show the ruler. They show the original photograph. They show the enlarged image only after the listener understands how small the object truly was. That respect for scale is part of the calm. The evidence is allowed to be small. It does not need to be made grand. In the Coldiron case, the smallness is almost the heart of it. A little fragment, a faint residue, a modest mark, each preserved and read through years of developing knowledge. They solved the case not by size, but by persistence. You can imagine the source object photographed from every angle. One photograph shows the whole thing, plain and worn. Another shows the edge where material had broken away. Another shows residue collected in a seam or corner. Another shows a comparison sample removed in controlled conditions. The object itself might seem unremarkable to a person walking past it in a shed. In the file, it is no longer unremarkable. It has context now. Context changes objects. A key becomes important if it opens a certain door. A receipt becomes important if it places someone at a certain counter. A stain becomes important if it carries a chemical memory of a place. The source object in the Coldiron case was still just an object, but it had become connected to time, movement and statement. That is enough to transform its role. The investigators likely revisited the original room's layout in a diagram. Measurements taken early were checked against photographs. Doorways, furniture, lines of movement, surfaces where contact could occur. The diagram was not decorative. It was a tool for thinking. You can see the clean lines on white paper, each label placed carefully, each arrow restrained. A diagram can calm a case because it lets the eye rest on structure. In that diagram, the location of the residue and mark mattered more than before. They appeared along a plausible path, not in a random corner. The fragment's location also fit that path, though with the usual caution required by time and movement. Together, they suggested not only that the material was present, but that something or someone had moved through the space in a way consistent with the later reconstruction. Reconstruction is a word that can sound larger than it is. Here, it means patient rebuilding, not pretending to see everything, not filling missing hours with certainty, just asking how known facts can fit into a sequence. You begin with the room, you add the trace, you add the object, you add access, you add time, you subtract what the evidence contradicts. The Coldiron case becomes a slow, careful arrangement. The case team may have practiced explaining that arrangement aloud. This is common before formal proceedings. It helps reveal gaps in logic. One person plays the role of the questioner, pressing on weak points. Could it be coincidence? Could it be contamination? Could the source object have been elsewhere? Could the witness be mistaken? Each question is answered with documents, not defensiveness. A patient case does not fear being tested. Some answers were necessarily limited. Yes, coincidence is always a possibility in the abstract, but the combined features made it less reasonable. Yes, contamination was considered, and the chain of custody did not support it. Yes, transfer was possible in some ways, but the placement and supporting facts narrowed those possibilities. The Coldiron case strengthened because the team did not pretend uncertainty had no place. They simply showed where uncertainty could and could not live. You sit with that phrase for a while, where uncertainty can live. Every unresolved case has houses for uncertainty, little rooms where unknowns gather. Solving a case does not always burn those houses down. Sometimes it closes the doors that should be closed and leaves only the rooms that do not change the answer. That is enough for law. It may be enough for a family. It is rarely enough for the heart, but the heart has its own work. The weird evidence had closed several doors. It closed the door on the idea that the trace was ordinary household dust. It closed part of the door on innocent access. It narrowed the explanation for the mark. It challenged the suspect's old account. It supported the witness who remembered texture and smell. The cold iron case became solvable because the evidence did not merely point, it also ruled out. Ruling out can be as important as pointing in. We return to that because it is restful, in a way. The patient detective does not need to chase every shadow forever. Some shadows can be measured and found to be furniture. Some can be opened and found empty. Some remain, but no longer block the path. In the cold iron file, the strange trace helped sort shadow from structure. The preparation continued with photographs of the evidence envelope itself. This may seem unnecessary until you remember how old the case was. The envelope was part of the story of preservation. The seal, the label, the handwriting, the date, the evidence number, all of it showed that the fragment presented now was the fragment collected then. You can see the envelope under soft overhead light, its paper wrinkled, its edges worn, its purpose intact. There is tenderness in an old evidence envelope. It was made to hold something small for a short while, perhaps, but it ended up holding a question for years. It passed through rooms, shelves, and hands. It was moved during inventories. It survived changes in staff and procedure. In the cold iron case, it became one of the unspeaking custodians of truth, plain and brown and easy to overlook. The prosecutor's review would have included possible defenses. That is not cynicism. It is preparation. If the evidence could be attacked on collection, the team had to answer. If it could be attacked on interpretation, the expert had to explain. If an innocent transfer theory could be raised, the investigators had to show why it did not fit the known facts. Every good question made the case more careful. You can imagine a list of anticipated challenges: chain of custody, alternative source, laboratory limitation, witness memory, timeline gap. Each one receives documents beneath it. The cold iron case is no longer a loose set of interesting findings. It is becoming an organized account, and organization is one of the ways patient work honors the people at the center of it. There was a conversation, perhaps several, with the family before public movement occurred. The investigators would not share every detail, but they would explain enough to prepare them. You can imagine a quiet room, chairs set close, tissues on a side table, no dramatic lighting, no cameras. The words are careful because they cannot be taken back. We have new evidence. We believe it is significant. The case is moving. For someone who waited years, even cautious words can be heavy. You do not hurry past that. The cold iron case may be solved in documents, but for the people who loved the person at its center, the news arrives through the body. A held breath, a hand tightening around a cup, a long look at the floor. Relief and sorrow do not take turns neatly. They often sit together. This is another reason the script stays soft. The facts do not need sharp edges added. The years have edges enough. We can speak plainly and leave room for silence. We can let the evidence be evidence and let the waiting be waiting. As you sit with the file, you are not consuming a mystery. You are keeping company with the long effort to answer one. When charges were considered, the case had to meet a standard beyond investigative belief. The weird evidence helped, but it had to be framed within the total record. The investigators could not say only that the fragment was unusual. They had to say why it mattered, how it was connected, what alternatives had been examined, and why the suspect's account no longer held. The cold iron case entered its next phase through that careful doorway. Formal documents tend to flatten emotion. They use names, dates, counts, and statutory language. They do not smell like old paper in the same way. They smell like fresh toner and office machines. Yet inside their plain paragraphs is the labor of years. The fragment is there. The residue is there. The scuff is there. The timeline is there. The witness memories are there, translated into the measured language of action. You turn those pages slowly, because formal language can make a case seem colder than it was. Beneath each sentence is a human act, Someone looked again, someone tested again, someone drove to an address, someone sat with a witness, someone signed an evidence transfer sheet, someone chose caution when haste would have felt easier. The Coldiron case was solved by weird evidence, yes, but also by people willing to let weird evidence become understood. The arrest process, if described in the file, would be brief. It would not dwell on spectacle. A name, a date, a location, a note that the person was taken into custody or notified through legal process. For our purposes tonight, the importance is not the moment of custody, it is the long path that made that moment possible. The room remains quiet. The file remains the center. We do not need to stand outside with flashing lights. After an arrest or formal accusation, cases often become quiet again for a while. Public interest may rise, but the work inside the file turns procedural. Discovery, motions, expert disclosures, additional testing requests, defense review, dates set and changed. You can hear the courthouse rhythm, the soft echo of footsteps in a hallway, the shuffle of papers at a clerk's counter, the low murmur of attorneys speaking near a bench. The Coldiron evidence had to survive this slower legal weather. Defense experts might examine it. They might question the lab methods. They might suggest alternate interpretations. That is part of the process. A strong case is not weakened by careful questioning if the underlying work is sound. It becomes clearer. The weird evidence, once fragile in appearance, had been made durable by documentation. You can imagine a defense expert looking through the microscope, not as an enemy of truth, but as another trained person testing claims. The sample sits under glass. The light adjusts. Notes are taken. Questions are asked about collection, storage, comparison, and interpretation. The Coldiron case passes through another set of hands, and each careful hand leaves the record more examined. Some details may have been debated. That is normal. The degree of similarity, the possibility of environmental transfer, the meaning of the mark, the rarity of the material. A patient narrator does not pretend these debates vanish. They are part of how a case becomes reliable enough to carry. In the end, what mattered was not that every expert phrase sounded absolute, but that the combined evidence remained coherent after scrutiny. The coherence of the Coldiron case lay in the way independent lines met. Physical trace met source object. Source object met access records. Access records met timeline. Timeline met statement inconsistencies. Witness memory met sensory evidence. Each line could be questioned, but the meeting of lines was harder to dismiss. This is why patient investigation so often depends on accumulation. It builds a room with several walls, not one. There may have been plea discussions, or there may have been preparations for trial. Either way, the evidence would have been central. The strange fragment and its companions would be described again and again in rooms where people weighed risk, certainty, and responsibility. You can picture the file opened on a table between attorneys, its pages flagged, its photographs marked. Outside, the courthouse windows reflect an ordinary sky. The passage of time complicated everything. Witnesses age, memories fade, some records disappear, but the preserved evidence helped compensate for what time had taken. It did not replace every lost voice. It could not bring back every forgotten hour. But it gave the case a physical spine. The Coldiron file could stand more upright because something from the beginning had remained. That is the quiet lesson the case keeps offering. Preserve what you can. Write clearly. Label carefully. Do not decide too soon that a small thing has no value. The person who saved the fragment may never have imagined future testing. The person who sealed the residue lift may not have known whether it would matter, but their care became a gift to people they might never meet years later, when the old question was finally asked in the right way. You can feel the old and new touching throughout the file, a faded photograph beside a digital enlargement, a handwritten note beside a typed lab report, a witness statement taken in one era beside a fresh interview recorded in another. The Coldiron case is almost an archive of changing methods, and yet the purpose stayed the same. Find what happened, do it carefully. Do not forget the person at the center. The person at the center should not disappear behind the evidence. Sleep scripts about investigation can become too fascinated by the mechanics if we are not careful. So we pause gently here. A case exists because a life was interrupted, and because people who cared were left with questions. The evidence matters because it served them. The weird fragment did not matter as a curiosity. It mattered because it helped answer what had been left unanswered. In the file, that person appears through ordinary details rather than spectacle. An address, a routine, a possession photographed in place, a name spoken by family, perhaps a favorite place mentioned in early background notes. We do not need to intrude. We only need to remember that patient detective work is not about cleverness alone. It is about service to the truth of a life. The Coldiron case, in its later phase, likely required victim background material to be reviewed again, not to sensationalize, but to establish context, relationships, habits, last known contacts, usual routes. These details can be tender. They are the shape of a person's days. You can imagine the investigator reading them quietly, aware that each ordinary routine once belonged to someone who expected to continue it. Such context also helped show why the suspect's connection stood out once the evidence was understood, not because suspicion was forced into the record, but because the ordinary patterns did not account for the trace. The fragment did not belong to the victim's routine. The residue did not match the room's common environment. The mark did not fit ordinary use. The Coldiron evidence became important because it crossed boundaries it should not have crossed. Boundaries are often where evidence speaks, inside and outside, known and unknown, routine and exception. A mark on the wrong side of a door, soil from a place someone claimed not to be, a fiber from a garment no one admitted wearing. In the Coldiron case, the boundary was material and contextual. The weird evidence carried one world into another, and that crossing eventually became visible. You can sit with that without strain. The file does not rush you. It lets you understand the movement slowly. A trace from a work environment appears in a private setting. A source object links to a person. A timeline allows contact where an account denied meaningful opportunity. Witness details support the physical finding. The path is not loud, it is steady. The legal proceedings may have brought the old evidence into a courtroom, a place with its own sounds and textures. Wooden benches, quiet coughing, paper folders opening, a judge's voice moving evenly through procedure. The evidence bags are handled with care. Photographs are displayed. Experts explain. People listen. The Coldiron case, which lived for years in boxes, is spoken aloud in a formal room. A courtroom can make evidence feel different. On a lab bench, it is material. In a file, it is documentation. In court, it becomes testimony. A person has to explain how they know what they know. They must answer questions clearly, even when the questions are designed to test every weak place. The weird evidence in the Coldiron case had to make that journey from object to explanation, and the patience behind it had to become visible to strangers. The expert would have described the fragment first in calm terms: size, appearance, collection location, testing method, comparison sample, observed similarities, limitations. The defense might ask whether another object could produce a similar fragment. The expert would answer with care, neither overstating nor retreating from the findings. That balance can be powerful. It shows that the conclusion does not depend on performance. Then the residue would be discussed, a faint trace, collected long ago, preserved under tape, later examined with better methods. The expert might explain how its composition aligned with the source environment. They might explain why ordinary household transfer was less consistent with the placement and supporting evidence. You can imagine jurors leaning slightly forward, not because the moment is dramatic, but because the smallness of the thing asks for attention. The mark would come after, perhaps through photographs and comparison images. The expert might show how pressure, angle, and material could produce the observed scuff. They would not claim to know every movement in the room. They would explain what the mark could reasonably support. In the Coldiron case, that restraint helped the evidence remain credible. It did not reach beyond itself. The investigator's testimony would bring the pieces together. They would describe reopening the file, reviewing the old evidence, requesting new testing, locating the source object, and comparing the results with statements and records. You can hear the measured rhythm. The questions are asked. The answers are given. The years are compressed, but not erased. Each step is placed before the listener like a page turned flat on a table. Cross-examination might press on time. Why did it take so long? Could memories be trusted? Were early assumptions wrong? These are fair questions. The answer, in essence, is that the case waited because the necessary understanding was not available sooner, and because careful people did not force an answer before the evidence could support one. The Coldiron case was not solved late because patience failed. It was solved late because patience endured. That may be the most restful truth in the file. Patience endured through dull paperwork, stored boxes, faded labels, and unanswered calls, through the unease of not knowing, through the humility of asking old evidence new questions. The weird evidence did not change while it waited. We changed around it. Our tools changed. Our questions changed. Our ability to compare and interpret changed. You turn another page, and there is likely a photograph of the evidence as presented. It may be mounted on board, labeled cleanly, perhaps enlarged for visibility. The fragment that once seemed like debris now sits in the center of a formal exhibit. The residue lift, once cloudy and plain, is explained as a carrier of context. The mark, once a scuff, has become a sign of contact. The Coldiron case has given these small things their proper names. The jury, if there was one, would have had to weigh all this without the years of intimacy the investigators had with the file. That is difficult. A juror meets the case in days or weeks. A detective may have carried it for years. The presentation must therefore be patient enough to invite understanding. It cannot assume the listener knows why a faded envelope matters. It must show them, slowly, clearly, without pressure. That is what we are doing here too, in a quieter way. You are the listener and the detective tonight, turning the Coldiron pages without the burden of deciding anyone's fate. You are simply noticing how patient work moves. You notice the paper, the dust, the gloved hands, the cautious phrases, the human memories, the small evidence that waited until it could be read. A verdict or legal resolution would come later in the file, but we are not there yet. For now, we remain with the evidence being weighed, because this is where the old case becomes most revealing, not in the final word, but in the careful approach to it. The fragment does not know it is important. The residue does not know it has traveled years. The mark does not know it has become part of an explanation. People give these things meaning by asking well. As the proceedings moved, the family may have sat through technical testimony that was both painful and necessary. They may have heard the same object described again and again. They may have learned details that investigators had kept quiet for years. Patient justice can be hard to receive because it arrives wrapped in procedure. Yet procedure is also what protects the answer from becoming merely a story someone wants to believe. The Coldiron case needed that protection. All old cases do. Years can create myths around a file. People remember rumors, newspapers simplify, communities fill gaps with guesses. But the evidence room is quieter than rumor. It holds what was actually collected. It holds what was actually written. It holds the small weird trace that did not care what anyone guessed. It simply waited for comparison. You can imagine a recess in the courtroom. People stand, stretch, speak softly. The evidence remains where it is, guarded by rules and custody. In a hallway, an attorney checks notes. An investigator drinks water from a paper cup. A family member looks out a window at traffic moving below. The world keeps doing ordinary things while an old question is being answered inside the building. That ordinariness is not disrespectful. It is the atmosphere in which most answers arrive. Cases are solved amid copier jams, lunch breaks, rain on courthouse steps, and the quiet patience of people who return after recess. The Coldiron case did not leave the ordinary world when it became important. It revealed how much the ordinary world had been holding all along. When testimony resumed, the timeline likely took center stage. The timeline is where evidence and human activity meet. A person can have access to material, but timing must allow transfer. A trace can exist in a place, but the path must be plausible. The Coldiron timeline, refined through receipts, statements, travel estimates, and records, gave the weird evidence a place to stand. You can see the timeline displayed in simple form. Morning, afternoon, evening. Confirmed points, open windows, movements that fit, movements that do not. No need for dramatic color. The clarity lies in placement. The suspect's old account covers less time than it once seemed to cover. The source material was accessible. The scene trace was found where contact would make sense. The witness memory sits near the relevant window. A timeline can feel like a lullaby of facts when read slowly. This happened. Then this was possible. This was confirmed. This was not. The mind follows the sequence and rests in the order. In the Coldiron case, the order did not erase the sorrow, but it reduced the confusion. For a file that had spent years in uncertainty, reduced confusion was a significant grace. The defense may have suggested that the strange evidence was being given too much meaning because investigators wanted a conclusion. That is another fair pressure. Wanting an answer can distort attention if not checked, but the record showed checks. Independent review, alternative sources considered, chain of custody confirmed, earlier assumptions corrected. In the Coldiron case, the evidence was not made meaningful by desire. It became meaningful through repeated testing against doubt. That repeated testing is why you can stay calm with it. The case is not asking you to feel persuaded by mood. It is inviting you to see the path. A fragment led to a source. A source led to access. Access joined time. Time challenged statement. Statement returned to witness. Witness joined trace. Trace returned to source. The circle did not close perfectly, because life rarely does, but it closed enough to carry weight. At some point, the physical exhibit was likely passed near the jury, or shown in detail. People may have looked at it with surprise, because it was so small. That surprise is understandable. We often expect important things to look important, but old investigations teach the opposite again and again. A stamp hinge, a thread, a torn corner of paper, a mineral grain, a bit of tape. The smallest things can outlast the loudest claims. The Coldiron fragment outlasted claims because it had no reason to change its story. It did not defend itself. It did not adapt. It remained what it was, preserved from the beginning. The human explanations around it shifted, tightened, and sometimes failed. The fragment simply stayed. There is a deep stillness in that, and perhaps that stillness is why physical evidence can feel so powerful in a cold file. The residue had the same stillness, though in a more delicate way. It was faint, partial, and easily overlooked, but once preserved, it too remained available. The mark remained in photographs, fixed by light at the moment someone thought to record it. Together, these pieces became a kind of quiet chorus, not singing loudly, but repeating the same direction in different tones. You can let that repetition settle. Fragment, residue, mark, object, access, time, statement, witness. Each word has weight now, but none needs to strike the table. The cold iron case is teaching through recurrence. It shows how a patient investigator returns to the same few facts until they are understood in relation to one another. The file is not wide anymore. It is deep. The next witness may have been the property officer or records custodian, someone whose work is often invisible. They explain how evidence was stored, how records were kept, how the item moved through official custody. Their testimony may seem less memorable than forensic science, but it is essential. Without custody, the strange evidence becomes a story without a spine. With custody, it remains connected to the original scene. You can picture them speaking plainly, perhaps with a binder open before them. They identify signatures. They explain procedures. They describe locked storage, inventory systems, and transfers to the lab. The language is administrative, but behind it is trust built step by step. The cold iron case needed that trust, and this witness helped provide it. The records custodian may also have explained the old business or maintenance document that connected the suspect to the source environment. Again, this is not glamorous work. It is the slow showing of paper. Here is the record. Here is when it was made. Here is who made it. Here is why it is kept. Here is what it says. In old cases, the keeper of ordinary records can become unexpectedly important. That is one of the humbling patterns in patient detective work. The person filing a service form may have no idea they are preserving a future fact. The technician sealing a fragment may not know they are saving a future comparison. The witness mentioning a smell may not know they are offering a future anchor. The cold iron case was solved through these modest acts, meeting one another across time. The court day ends, and the file closes for the evening. The evidence returns to secure storage. The courtroom empties. Chairs scrape softly. Papers are gathered. Outside, evening light lies across the courthouse steps, and people leave carrying very different thoughts. You remain with the file in the calm space of the story, aware that even after testimony, the work is not finished. It is simply moving, carefully, toward its next page. That next page begins with more examination, because old cases rarely move in a straight line once they enter court. A motion may challenge a piece of evidence. A hearing may focus on admissibility. Experts may be questioned outside the presence of a jury. The cold iron case, already tested by investigators, is tested again by legal rules. This can feel slow, but slowness is not failure. It is the system asking whether the evidence should be heard. The judge may listen while each side explains the value and limits of the weird evidence. The fragments comparison, the residues composition, the marks interpretation, the chain of custody, the possibility of prejudice if the evidence is misunderstood. These are careful questions, and they belong in the room. Evidence must not only be interesting, it must be reliable enough and relevant enough to help, rather than confuse. The ruling, when it comes, is written or spoken in measured terms. Some evidence may be allowed with limits. Some phrasing may be restricted. Experts may be told to avoid overstating conclusions. This is not a weakening of the case. It is a shaping of how the truth may be presented responsibly. The cold iron case continues to move because its central evidence can survive being shaped by caution. You can feel the old file adapting to each room it enters. In the evidence room, it is object and label. In the lab, it is sample and comparison. In the investigator's office, it is timeline and statement. In court, it is exhibit and testimony. The cold iron case remains itself through all of these forms because the underlying care keeps each version connected to the last. As the days pass, the strange evidence becomes familiar to everyone involved. What was once odd becomes almost routine through repetition. The jurors, attorneys, judge, investigators, and family have all seen the fragment enlarged, the residue explained, the mark placed on diagrams. But familiarity does not reduce its importance. If anything, patient repetition helps the evidence settle into its proper place, no longer surprising, simply present. That is how many truths arrive. First as surprise, then as question, then as work, then as something everyone in the room can see. The Coldiron case followed that path slowly, and you follow it now in the quiet, letting each stage have its time. There is no need to hurry to the final page. The work itself is the story tonight. A later witness may have spoken about the suspect's access to the source object. This testimony would not need to be dramatic. It might involve employment, storage, repair, ownership, or use. The important point is proximity and familiarity. The person knew the object, or had reason to handle it, or had access to the environment it came from. The weird evidence had identified a material world, and this witness placed the suspect within that world. You can hear the questions. Did you recognize this object? Where was it kept? Who used it? Was it in that condition then? Did it shed material? Did it leave residue? The answers are practical. They describe habits and storage, not emotion. A shelf in a shed, a workbench, a vehicle, a back room, the smell of oil or dust, the way material flaked when moved, ordinary facts calmly gathered. Those ordinary facts mattered because they made the physical transfer plausible. Not merely possible in the abstract, but plausible in the lived arrangement of things. The Coldiron case depended on lived arrangement of things. The Coldiron case depended on lived arrangement. Who had keys? Who borrowed tools? Which door stuck? Which surface collected grit? Which route someone took without thinking? Investigation often lives in these humble spaces, where life's routines quietly explain evidence. Another page in the file may hold a photograph of the source location. It is not beautiful. It may show shelves, concrete, a coiled cord, old boxes, dust gathered in corners. Yet after everything we have read, the photograph feels important. You can almost smell it. Damp air, metal, wood shavings, aged cardboard. This was the environment the evidence carried with it, a little piece of place, transferred into the Coldiron case. Place can cling to people, on shoes, sleeves, hands, tires, tools and objects. Most of the time, those traces vanish before anyone thinks to ask about them. In the Coldiron case, enough remained. Enough was collected. Enough could be interpreted later. That word returns again, gentle and steady. Enough, not everything. Enough, not perfection. Enough to bring an old question nearer to answer. The suspect's account of the source object may have changed over time. Perhaps they first minimized access, then acknowledged more when records required it. Perhaps they offered a reason the material might have transferred innocently, but that reason did not align with the room, the residue, or the timeline. The file would record each version. You can imagine the investigator writing carefully, knowing that exact wording may matter later. Changing accounts do not prove everything by themselves. People forget. People misspeak. People grow defensive when questioned. A careful investigator knows this and does not treat every inconsistency as guilt. But when an inconsistency matches the pressure points created by physical evidence, it becomes more significant. In the Coldiron case, the changes were read beside the trace, not apart from it. That is the patient way. No one page stands alone if another page can test it. The statement is tested by the record. The record is tested by the lab is tested by the photographs. The photographs are tested by the chain of custody. The witness is tested by consistency and context. The cold iron file becomes a web of quiet checks, each one preventing the story from drifting. Late in the proceedings, the prosecution may have called the investigator who coordinated the cold case review. This person could explain why the file was reopened and how the strange evidence came back into focus. Their testimony would be about process, and process is the heart of tonight's telling. They might describe reading the original inventory, noticing the unusual trace, ordering tests, receiving results, and following those results outward. You can imagine their voice remaining even. They are not there to dramatize the years. They are there to account for them. They explain that old evidence was preserved, that newer methods allowed a more specific analysis, and that follow-up investigation connected the findings to a person and timeline. The cold iron case, in their telling, becomes a patient sequence of documented decisions. The defense may ask why certain things were not done earlier. Sometimes the answer is simple. The technology was not available. The sample was too small for old methods. The case had other priorities then. A lead seemed more promising and later failed. Investigations are human systems, and human systems do not see everything at once. The important fact is that the evidence remained, so a later generation could ask better questions. There is humility in admitting that earlier investigators did not know what later investigators would know. It does not dishonor them. It places them in time. The first team did the work available to them. The later team used what time had added. The cold iron case was not a story of one era correcting another with superiority. It was a story of one era handing a small sealed envelope to the next. That image can stay with you. A sealed envelope moving forward through years. It passes from hand to shelf, from shelf to inventory, from inventory to review, from review to lab, from lab to courtroom. The paper grows older. The question inside remains. And when the question is finally asked properly, the envelope gives what it has been holding. The trial record, if you read it at night, may have long stretches that feel almost hypnotic. Objections, foundations, exhibit numbers, repeated instructions. The pace can be slow enough to soften the edges of attention. Yet inside that formal rhythm, the cold iron case continues its careful work. Each exhibit is admitted. Each witness establishes one portion. Each question adds a small piece to the shared understanding. At some point, the old photographs are shown again. The room from the beginning returns, but now everyone sees it differently. The place where the fragment was found, the surface where residue was lifted, the mark that once looked like wear. The photograph has not changed, just as it had not changed when the investigator first reread the file. Understanding changed around it. That is one of the quiet wonders of evidence. You may have experienced this with an old family photograph, noticing after years a person in the background, a car at the curb, a calendar on the wall. The image was always holding the detail. You were not ready to see it, or you had no reason to see it. The cold iron photographs worked that way. They held the trace in place until the case learned how to look. Looking is a skill, and patient looking is rarer than it sounds. It means letting the eye return without demanding novelty. It means tolerating the boredom before meaning appears. It means noticing not only what is present, but where it rests, how it touches other things, and what ordinary explanation would have to be true for it not to matter. The cold iron case rewarded that kind of looking. The court may hear about the original search for suspects, and how the person later charged was not ignored, only not yet reachable by evidence. That distinction matters. Old files sometimes contain names that hover without resolution. A person may be interviewed and released from focus because the facts do not yet support more. Years later, new testing can bring that name back, not through obsession, but through newly available support. You can imagine the early detective's note beside the name, cooperative. Account given. No further at this time. Such notes can be frustrating in hindsight, but they may have been appropriate then. Investigators cannot build a case out of unease alone. The Coldiron case needed the weird evidence to become readable before the old unease could be tested responsibly. Once it became readable, the name no longer floated. It connected. That is the difference between suspicion and evidence. Suspicion drifts around a person. Evidence ties facts to a person in ways that can be examined. In the Coldiron case, the fragment tied to source, source tied to access, access tied to timeline, and timeline tied to words spoken long before anyone knew a fragment would return. The closing arguments, when they eventually arrive, would likely frame the evidence in that same pattern. But we are not moving into finality yet. We remain in the slow middle, where the facts are still being placed, and the listener can rest inside the method. The Coldiron case is less a race toward a verdict than a study in how small things survive long enough to matter. A recess comes again. The courtroom settles into silence. The exhibit boards lean against a wall. Someone switches off a projector, and the screen goes blank. The strange evidence returns to its envelope or secure container. Outside, perhaps rain begins against the windows, soft and steady, turning the courthouse steps darker stone by stone. You can hear it if you let the file become a room around you. Rain has a way of making old paper smell stronger. In our quiet imagined archive, the Coldiron folders rest under the lamplight, and the air carries dust, ink, cardboard, and weather. You turn one page and then another, not to reach the end, but to remain with the care that finally moved the case. The evidence list continues, and the next entry waits beneath your hand, ready to be read slowly in its turn. The rain softens against the courthouse glass, and the Coldiron file rests in that dim, steady light where even difficult things can be held gently for a while. By the time the evidence had been weighed, checked, challenged, and placed beside the old statements, the case no longer belonged only to rumor or uncertainty. It had been solved through patient work, through preserved trace evidence, through the strange little fragments that waited in envelopes until someone returned with better questions and steadier tools. So the real status is not an open silence in this telling. The Coldiron case was solved after years of waiting, and the answer came not from one loud moment, but from the careful joining of small things that had been kept safe when they still seemed almost too ordinary to matter. That is a quiet kind of resolution, and it carries its own tenderness, because even when a case is solved, the years before the answer do not simply disappear. They remain in the paper, in the memories, and in the long patience of the people who kept looking. You can let the file close now. The photographs go back into their sleeves. The evidence list lies flat beneath the last page. The lamp makes a small circle of amber on the desk, and beyond it, the room grows soft at the edges. Nothing more has to be asked tonight. The strange evidence has said what it could say. The patient hands have done their work, and the old question can finally rest in the quiet where all closed files sleep.